A Maze of Death by Philip K. Dick. Maybe not one of Philip K. Dick's best known books, and maybe not without good reason, but definitely one of the dickiest of Philip K. Dick's books. So I want to say that this is like the 11th book by Philip K. Dick that I have read, or thereabouts at least. And it was weird when reading this because my reception towards it changed as the book progressed. So I'll say up front that in a technical capacity, this is absolutely not one of Philip K. Dick's best works. But ultimately, it had just enough of the Dickian elements that you might expect from one of his books, and they were put together in such a way that ultimately it somewhat redeemed itself in my estimation, because for about the first half of this book, it was not getting a very good rating from me. But the second half, I'll say it kicked it up a notch, and ultimately my reception toward it ended up being more positive than I thought it would have been at first when I started reading this book. But I will do my best to explain. So, what is the story of A Maze of Death? Well, 14 people, and I'm not even going to bother naming them because they are nothing more than names. The characters in this book are insanely flat. And I trust me, I'm going to get to that. That's one of my major criticisms of this book. We're going to talk about that when we talk about character. But 14 people have been selected to colonize this planet named Delmac O. And they get there. It's a weird planet. There's some weird ass crap on the planet. An alien world might be expected, right? But then they start getting bumped off one by one. This is basically like Philip K. Dick's science fictional version of Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. It feels very much like that. These people start getting bumped off either by each other or by some outside force. It's kind of a mystery. Again, this is something of a mystery. And then they start kind of turning on each other. There's some frictions in between them. Then they eventually learn that all is not as it seems in this world on this planet of Delmac O. And then, wouldn't you know it, at the end, spoilers, I'm about to spoil this book. Leave now or forever hold your peace. At the end, it is revealed that none of this was actually real. It was all just a simulation, and that the actual 14 people who are the characters, the cast of this book, are actually the crew of a spaceship which has been damaged and is orbiting a dead star, presumably forever. They're basically stranded alone. And they're basically just running these simulations, these mental simulations on this computer on board their ship for lack of anything better to do. It's either that or just go insane and then die, and then kill each other in real life. So they're just kind of putting it's kind of like the Matrix. They're kind of uploading their minds for a time into this simulation. Like I say, for lack of anything better to do. And that's pretty much the book. Again, it's not a long book. Philip K. Dick's books rarely, if ever, were particularly long. So that's kind of the story of A Maze of Death in a nutshell. So now let's talk about the technical qualities of it and why I say this is absolutely, in a technical capacity, not one of his best books. So let's talk about the writing first off. Philip K. Dick was never noted for particularly beautiful prose. His prose was very workmanlike, very without any kind of pomp or circumstance to it. It's very direct. It's very simplistic. He doesn't go in much for flowery metaphors or anything. It's just, get in there, get the story told in the most direct and simplistic manner. I wouldn't go so far as to say that that type of approach to writing necessarily constitutes bad writing. I mean, as long as you structure the sentences correctly, as long as you give enough detail and whatnot to flesh the story out, I guess it could qualify as like competent writing, like fine writing. Um, yeah, but this book in particular is not one of Philip K. Dick's strongest works in terms of its writing. And like I say, that's kind of saying something because he was never really noted for being a particularly gifted prose stylist. But, and I really should have like like marked some of the issues that I had in this book, but I didn't. So just suffice it to say, there were several times in this book, like several instances in this book, where something jumped out at me and I was like, that really could have been worded better. Um, there were redundancies in the prose at times. There were oddly worded sentences where things really should have been changed to read better, to flow better. Again, I really should have marked some of the issues that I had, but I didn't. So all I can say is that there were several times when reading this book where a line or a phrase jumped out at me, and it was kind of conspicuous because of how awkward it was and how much better it really could have been worded. In fact, there's the kind of impression that A Maze of Death gave to me is that it was is one of haste. It feels like something that was written um, like in a pretty like quick manner, and that's not surprising because while Philip K. Dick may be a pretty acclaimed and respected writer now, during his lifetime he absolutely was not. He was a pulp writer who was churning out books at a pretty fast pace in order to pay bills and make a living. He was a very marginal writer who had to tell stories very quickly, get books out very quickly in order to, like I say, make that dough, right? And that is the impression I got with A Maze of Death, because I don't know that this book was edited as strongly as it really should have been. Well, I know it was not edited as strongly as it should have been, given the fact that there were so many instances that leaped out at me as awkward and needing to be revised. So I think that this book may have been written a tad hectically and not gone over as thoroughly as it should have been. That's kind of, again, just the impression that I got with it. So the writing, it's not great. I have to say the writing is lackluster somewhat in this particular case. So I got to knock it for the writing. Now let's get to the characters. Probably the most egregious shortcoming in this book. Just as Philip K. Dick was not noted for particularly strong prose, neither was he noted for particularly strong characters. What Philip K. Dick was known for, and ultimately what his reputation rests upon, is very cerebral concepts and ideas regarding philosophy and religion and stuff that give his books, they give the reader something to chew on when reading his books. They're very, like, again, cerebral type reads, but character was not something that he was really noted for. There are some instances in his bibliography where he does have some decent character work. A Scanner Darkly comes to mind. As well, his final book, The Transmigration of Timothy Archer, that has some genuinely good character work in it. In fact, again, I would have to reiterate something I've said before. I think The Transmigration of Timothy Archer actually is his finest hour as a writer. I think that actually is pound for pound his best book, but that's a matter for a different video perhaps. But A Maze of Death is particularly lacking in the character department, and once again, that's really saying something given that Philip K. Dick's characters are typically so flat and poorly rendered, but he's really taking it to a whole nother level in A Maze of Death. And that's partly perhaps because it has such a sizable cast that it has 14 main characters. It has a cast of 14, and they are nothing more than names. They are as thin as the paper that they exist upon. they have virtually no depth. A lot of their personalities are kind of thinly rendered. There's virtually nothing to remark upon here. The characters, there's not much to latch onto here. And given the fact that so many of them die in this, again, it's a simulation ultimately, but given that so many of them die in the story, you kind of want it to have some kind of impact, to hit kind of hard, but it never does, ever. Like, all the characters that die, you don't give a crap, or I didn't give a crap. He could have killed all of them, and I would not have cared, because they're just that thin. They're just cardboard. They are nothing more than cardboard. And again, even some of his other books that are not known for like really in-depth characterization, like The Man in the High Castle or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, like, given the fact that the casts of those books are at least smaller, you still get a little bit more depth with those books, simply because there aren't so many characters that it has to switch back and forth between. But this book has a pretty sizable cast, and again, it's not a long book, as Philip K. Dick's books rarely, if ever, were. Um, there's just nothing here. Like, the character work is just abysmal. Just to put it bluntly, it is truly abysmal character work in this. So, gotta knock it big time for the characters. But now let's get to the actual story of the book, and again, the kind of Dickian concepts at play in the story, and I'll kind of try to explain why it ultimately somewhat redeemed itself, especially in the second half of the book, the way it all came out. It did somewhat redeem itself, just because it did some things that may stand the chance of catching the reader off guard. So it has all the hallmarks of a Philip K. Dick story. You have lots of philosophizing. You also have lots of theologizing. In particular, it's right in the vein of Philip K. Dick's kind of uniquely Gnostic branch of Christianity. There's actually a whole kind of in-depth theology within the book. In fact, the theological matters in the book actually get much more attention than the characters do, which again is kind of a knock against it, perhaps. But it does have all the Dickian elements. Like I say, you've got philosophy, you've got theology, and again, a pretty developed, in-depth theology. Also, you have just the simulated reality, right? Nothing is what it seems. It's just it's all a kind of a Matrix type story. But then at the end of the book, we see that it's some of the stuff that we think is unique specifically to the simulation actually bleeds over into the real world. And again, I guess I spoiled kind of most of the book, but I won't spoil everything. I'll just say that there are some elements that you think are fictitious, but then ultimately end up being real. I mean, it's all fiction, but there, within the context of the story, there are some things that you think are not real that end up being real, and that was pretty interesting. Now, I have to say, the thing about A Maze of Death that really struck me is how closely this book resembles another of Philip K. Dick's books, that being Ubik. And then I actually looked it up. Ubik was published in 1969, I believe, and A Maze of Death was published the following year in 1970, I believe. And they share a lot of common elements. The kind of, is it all a dream twist at the end, right? The characters caught in some kind of simulation and an artificial world, but also the theological elements. Like, if you've read Ubik, you know that the entity known as Ubik, ultimately kind of transcends the simulated reality that the characters are trapped within. Again, the kind of the theological aspects transcend the artificial world that the characters exist in within the confines of the story. And that happens, like I say, at the end of this book too. It has kind of the same twist, but I have to say, as poor as this book was on a technical level, story wise, I actually did like it a bit more than Ubik, and that may make me a Philip K. Dick heretic here, because Ubik is one of his most acclaimed books, and it is not for me. I actually didn't really like Ubik all that much. I don't think the story makes much sense if you actually like analyze it, and that ending that everybody like just loses their mind over about it. Oh my goodness, it just flips the whole thing on its head. I just saw that as a cheap fake out that was just him just throwing one last little gotcha into the story. Again, I don't think that book makes much sense. If you really like get down to the nitty gritty, and again, it's the characters aren't really that much better in that book either, or the writing is not particularly striking either. So honestly, again, that may make me a Philip K. Dick heretic, but I really don't like Ubik all that much. Story wise, I actually like A Maze of Death more. And again, I'm just comparing it to Ubik because of how similar they are. Like again, if you read both of these books like back to back, I think you may like see that they share a lot of common elements. And even though once again on a technical level this book is pretty poor, story wise it is intriguing. It intrigued me, especially in the second half, because in the first half I was just kind of struck by the kind of clunkiness of it, of how of the writing and the characters and such. But once you get to the second half, things start to pick up and a lot of stuff starts to happen. And I was hooked in that second half, and especially the way that it all comes out, the ending. I have to say, it did somewhat redeem itself, at least plot wise. And I actually did ultimately end up enjoying the story itself, even if I didn't really enjoy the execution of the story. But with all that said, how would I rate A Maze of Death? I would give this book, I think, a good rating that I could give this book is a C plus. It's definitely not one of his best works in a technical capacity, but it has pretty much all the hallmark Dickian elements in this, and again, they're put together in a pretty intriguing way, or at least for my tastes, they were. So again, I can't probably give it anything higher than a C plus, but I'll say that I did ultimately end up enjoying it. So yeah, a C plus. I think that's probably what I could give this book. So yes, A Maze of Death by Philip K. Dick. Have you read A Maze of Death? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read A Maze of Death, I could recommend this to the Dick fans out there, the fanboys, the Philip K. Dick completionists. I could recommend this to. If you've never read a book by Philip K. Dick before, you might not want to start with this one because it might kind of off put you with how poor the quality of the technical aspects can be at times. So I would not recommend this to newbies or first time Dick readers. Don't let this be your first Dick. But if you are a fan, if you do like his stuff, then I would say this is probably a safe bet, because it's not going to knock your socks off as regards the quality of its prose or the depth of its characterization. But the story is interesting, and it did somewhat redeem itself in my eyes again because of that. So yeah, I could recommend this to the Dick fans out there. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.